pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here with an incredibly special guest, the Irish writer, Lynn Buckle. Welcome to my channel, Lynn.
Thanks for having me, Shawn. It's great to be online with you.
It's just an absolute delight. I read Lynn Buckle's second novel, What Willow Says, when it came out. What month was that, Lynn?
That was at the end of May of this year.
End of May. And I didn't realize that Lynn had been watching some of my videos before that, which made me, I think, even more excited than maybe she was by my review. But ever since then, I've wanted to have Lynn come on my channel. So we're going to talk about Lynn as a writer just for a short time. I've extracted a promise from Lynn that she's going to come back and we're going to delve into her writing more another day. But I love chatting with writers about themselves as readers. So we're going to talk about Lynn Buckle as a reader today. But first of all, can you give us an elevator pitch about your first novel from 2018, The Groundsman, which I have not yet read?
Well, The Groundsman is really different to what Willow said. It's a polar opposite. So if you're expecting gentle relationships in nature, it's more about the harshness of some relationships. So it has a huge kick to it emotionally, in the same way that what Willow says has a huge emotional impact on the reader. I think you were quite affected by what Willow says, weren't you, emotionally? Most readers are. But The Groundsman is about the difficulties of relationships and sometimes the nastiness, and trying to find the light within that. So it's about domestic violence, it's about incest, and it's written from 5 points of view. So it's kind of slots between a little child and different adults, and it's all set in Dublin, you know, near the areas where I live and a lot of my family live. So yeah, it's contemporary as well. So it's very intense, it's very internalized, and it's quite harrowing, but it's written in the same style in which I always write. So that was my first book.
I heard about it from Ronan Hession, another Irish author, and he talked about it as having a lot of mythological stuff in it. Is that right?
Yes, and I know you're not particularly fond of mythology.
Well, I didn't think so, but now I loved the mythology in your second novel, What Willow Says, so I'm ready to dive in and tackle The Groundsman next.
Well, it's Greek mythology, which I concentrate on in The Groundsman. I'm using Greek mythology basically to lend meaning and power to the characters. So it's not a mythological story by any means. I just use them as references. So I suppose there's a bit of kind of literary showing offmanship, if you like. If you read any of the Greek stories of mythology as a child, as I did, you'll recognise some of the characters. Some of the names are deliberate references to some of the characters in Greek mythology. And I think I was very interested as a child, because I'm an artist. I was very interested in the book illustrations. That's what interested me in Greek mythology as a child, and particular books which I had. And that stuck with me. So when I came to writing the book, that's what really inspired me to include them. And I suppose as an art historian as well, you know, and I teach art, and my first degree was in art history. You know, and everything that you're learning in art history is going back to the Greek references, and then any references throughout history come into art. So those kind of stories are always playing in my mind, and kind of slipping them in and trying to make use of them, I suppose. It's all those kind of experiences that I've had, not just as a reader, but as an artist and an art historian. They all end up in my writing.
Where can we see your art? Is it
at
online?
the moment? Not particularly, no. I think in the last 6 years, I didn't completely abandon my art practice, which I've been a professional artist for most of my life. I put it to one side and writing took over. Now, it just so happens that I wrote about creating artwork in What Willow Says.
Yes, you sure
and
did.
I surely did. And last year, I decided to carry out some of the artwork that I described in What Willow Says.
Oh.
I thought it'd be interesting to actually complete what I was describing. And so I do have in my studio some very large pieces. They're about 6 foot by 4 foot. And they're exactly the pieces which the character in What Willow Says describes that she couldn't actually complete because of her health status, but she describes what they would be like to create them. So I've been creating those, and they're based on the bogs of Ireland, and they're what you would call erasure pictures. So a picture appears and you draw it and colour it in and scrape it away, and you create and create and create layers, and you gradually take those layers off again, but you're left with a history of your activity on the paper, the scrapings and the scratches and the erasures. And that's a bit like the bogs where I live on the bog of Allen. Different layers build up and wear away again.
I think we're talking on July 25th, and isn't this a special day?
It is, Shawn. It's International Peat Bog Day today.
International Peat Bog Day. Wow.
And I bet you didn't know that even existed, but I was very pleased that we had our interview today.
Fantastic. So what happens on International Peat Bog Day?
Well, I think it's not just a celebration of these wonderful habitats which are under threat of extinction. It's a day to also say, you know, we need to act quickly to save them, and we need to reinstate some, especially where I live, where they've all been cut away and burnt in an industrial scale. They've been cut away to fuel power stations. So they need reflooding because their carbon sinks. I think the English, I think you haven't actually said it yet, but I'm deaf, and I'm getting pretty good at Irish Sign Language, but not English Sign Language, which is different. But I found out from one of the bog conferences that I went to that the sign in English for bog is this. It's literally a pulling down to the peat bogs. It's like the pulling down of the history of the layers, and it sinks here. You know, there's the weightedness of all those layers of history sits at the bottom. So I think that's a lovely symbol for the peat bogs, which store carbon and they store history. And I write about that in What Willow Says, the histories which are stored within them.
Sure do. It's a really powerful part of the book.
And there are very few books really that I have read which places the deaf reader and the deaf person into the stories in a positive light.
That's right. So yeah, let's move in and talk about What Willow Says for a few minutes, because that was a really powerful component. The first person narrator, the report writer, is the grandma, and she has a deaf granddaughter who is, I believe, 8 years old.
That's right, yes. So the story is really of her trying to learn sign language and learn how to communicate with her deaf granddaughter, who she is the carer for, the main parent, basically. And she doesn't have sign language to begin with. So it's about her journey and her positive understanding of deafness as well. I think I wanted to write a very positive story of deafness rather than the usual tropes and the usual kind of poor, sad disability type stories, because there are so many things I could say which are difficult about being deaf, and I didn't really want to put that down. I could write a whole book about that, but I wanted to write all the positive things and the beauty of sign language and the beauty of communication. And these two characters in the book use nature as a vehicle for learning about their relationship and about each other, and they use nature as what we'd say I can't pronounce it, heuristic device. Nature as a heuristic device, which is a learning tool to learn from each other and from nature. And it's a kind of a literary geography as well. You know, they're exploring the landscape together and kind of deep diving into that landscape, the bogs and the trees, and we're learning about the different types of trees and the different sounds which come through the trees as the wind blows through them. So it's a kind of but it's also an emotional story. It's about their relationship. It's about love between two people. And, you know, I wanted to go deeper than someone like Sebald, who wrote Rings of Saturn. You know, he's very deep dives into the geography of a place and the stories of a place, but he doesn't actually put any of his kind of personal feelings into his kind of tour guide of the east of England. So I definitely wanted, the emotional kick that you get from having the people within that landscape.
I am an emotional reader, and I like fiction that elicits feelings from me, and I also really need it to be literary enough where I don't feel like I'm being toyed with, or it's not overly sentimental, because that nothing turns me off faster. So your novel, What Willow Says, was the perfect read for me. The difficulty that the grandmother and granddaughter, who are not named, the difficulties that they have, the challenges they have to communicate with each other, and kind of the indirectness and the kind of grasping for how to get certain ideas and sensations and experiences across to each other, brings them and brings the story to a place of beauty that, if it had been more direct and had been easier to say, it would not have been nearly as powerful.
I'm not going to say it now. I don't want to do a plot spoiler, but I think in your review of it, you did the same as me. You didn't actually say exactly how it does that. You have to read the book to find that out.
The title doesn't give anything away, but it does show you the central quest or question.
Exactly. Yes.
Willow Says.
And I did loads of research, and I did loads of fantastic reading around that, and that's, you asked me to talk about my reading, and I've read so many non-fiction books, which I wasn't particularly a non-fiction reader at all. But, in researching that book and another one which is under editorship at the moment, I found out so much about trees, which I didn't know before.
So yeah, let's talk about Lynn Buckle is a reader. So keep going. So what do you want to tell us about some of these tree books?
Oh, right. Well, I will. I have one here, and this is non-fiction, and I will get to some fiction ones in a minute, because I know you prefer the fiction. But this
No, anything is good.
The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. I know you can't see that because of the light, but that's not a new book. And it's not based on new ideas, because it's really based on the work of a woman in America called Suzanne Simard. And it was her research in the forests of North America which resulted in all these other books being written. Finding the Mother Tree is a book that she has written. It's just come out this year, Finding the Mother Tree. And that's a really hard read for me, because it's completely non-fiction, and I need something which I can relate to a bit more. Like yourself, I need that emotional content, and I find the non-fiction very, very hard going. It's a bit like doing a geology degree, to be honest. But it was her research which I relied upon for writing What Willow Says. And another author who wrote a book which I think really has kind of summed up her work was called The Overstory by Richard Powers.
Right there.
Oh, you have it.
I have it, and it didn't work for me, so I didn't finish, but I enjoyed the first third of it, and then I couldn't continue. But how did it go for you?
Well, I persisted, because I was a bit like that to begin with. It was a bit too much of it's more non-fiction, it seems like, but those separate chapters eventually all join up.
See, and that's the point at which I got lost. I thought I couldn't go with him when it started to get a little bit too tree huggy for me. And whereas the introduction of each character in that first third, they read kind of like standalone short stories, and I thought they were beautifully written. And the whole thing about the trees, I thought was, for the most part, really powerful. And then I didn't get very far. I maybe should have gone further, but it started to drive me crazy, and I stopped.
I persisted because I wanted to see how would he link these short stories together, and he does quite brilliantly in the end. But it's very easy to stop reading because of that. And you're right, there is the tree huggy stuff, but there are also the other areas as well, which are less tree huggy, and they do all connect in. And there is a character who's working in her office, isn't there, right near the beginning? And I think she's in Japan. I could be wrong. And she's talking about the tree that she can see out in the yard from her office. So they do all link up eventually in a very clever way. So I think that's kind of one of the seminal fiction works, really, which puts into into practice all of the non-fiction discoveries about trees and their interconnectedness and all of that. So I didn't read that until after I'd what Willow says, but the work by Suzanne Simard that I definitely had been very aware of, and the interconnectedness between trees, and how can you bring people into that story anyway. So she was very influential, I think, in my writing. And like I said, I do really struggle with the non-fiction. So I do like something which has a bit more poetry to it. So another author who I absolutely love, she wrote Casting Deep Shade, C.G. Wright, the late poet C.G. Wright. And she's an American poet, really, who writes a lot of eco-poetry. And her last book, Casting Deep Shade, was published posthumously. She had spent a good number of years researching it, and it's more of a kind of a verse novel. And she writes about the relationship between beech trees in particular and humans. I like a verse novel because I like poetry and I like poetic writing, as you can probably tell. So it's not the traditional novel, but it's a thick book. It's a very thick book, and it includes pictures as well, and a terrible introduction, which I would advise anyone reading it to avoid. But anything that's written by her is wonderful, and I think it definitely shows the relationship between humans and trees. I think I've done trees at this point. I've done reading all about trees, and I've done writing about trees. But there is another book to come out through me, which does have a lot of trees in it. So I think I've kind of exploited trees as much as I can at this point. But the poetic side of writing is very, very important to me. And even Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminsky. Have you read that?
I have not. I've heard quite a bit about it. I've had mixed reviews of it, but what did you think of it?
I loved it because he used deafness not as a weapon, but as a form of defense. And, he is a deaf author as well. So he has that experience, and I love his poetry for a start. And I love the verse novel effect, and I love the concept of conflict as well, from his own family history, who are refugees from Eastern Europe to America. So he has that kind of history within his genes, basically. And so he used his own experience of deafness to write that verse story. And it's quite interesting as well that he uses hearing people and non-deaf people to pretend to be deaf.
Huh.
Because the entire town in the story, in fact, are invaded and taken over by a political power which they have no control over. And in order to carry on living within this village in Eastern Europe, the entire village pretend to be deaf. So they pretend not to hear the soldiers' orders, and they make up a new sign language for their own city to communicate with each other. And the sign language evolves anyway, and I'm very interested in the semantics of sign language and how sign languages are created, in the same way that I'm interested in written words and how the written language evolves. So he kind of created a whole new language, even though he has his own sign language. And I think that's really useful for readers as well, because if you were to stick to one form of sign language, say Japanese sign language would be different to Irish sign language, would be different to American sign language, in the same way spoken languages are different in each country. So he created a universal sign language for this book, and that's quite useful as well, because he does use a few illustrations, not that you can really communicate just by seeing drawn illustrations. So yeah, I thought that was a really good and powerful example and a role model for deaf people and deaf readers anyway. And it introduces to a wider public, deafness and sign language and the powers that you can use in that. In what Willow says, I used it as a weapon in one point, that I weaponized sign language in a short clip of a story in what Willow says. So yeah, I really like that. And Jan Carson, who's a Northern Ireland writer, she created a story which included a pretend deaf character as well. So I'm wondering where all the pretend deafness comes from. But and if I were to describe it, there's kind of magical realism in it, and I can easily put people off by saying that. But coming from a deaf reader's perspective, she hasn't appropriated it badly. She's done it really, really well, and there is a very good reason why deafness has to be pretended in that story. So I found her writing quite interesting in that sense, and she's not writing from a deaf perspective, but she's put a deaf character in, and who's pretending to be deaf, and done it really well.
And is that story in a published collection, or?
The Fire Starters, it's a novel in itself, and that came out, I think, so that came out last year, I think it was, or the year before. There isn't very much really which references deafness in a positive light. So those are the only three, my own, What Willow Says, and Jan's and Ilya's are really the only three positive ones. There's a lot of YA literature. I'm not a YA writer, and I'm not a YA reader, probably for that reason, and I kind of leave that specialism to everybody else. And there are a good few children's books which kind of introduce deafness, but just to throw in a deaf character into a story would be great, where it doesn't have to be a story about deafness, just happens to be inclusive, put it that way.
In my reading travels, I can only remember one novel. It was a gay novel, and it was tangential, but one of the main characters, it was a gay couple, and one of the men had been raised as a hearing child, and he was brought up by deaf parents.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, and that was by Alex Jeffers, and called Safe as Houses. Alex Jeffers is the American poet Robin Jeffers. Is it Robin Jeffers? Robinson Jeffers' grandson. And it's one of my favorite gay novels, Safe as Houses. But it's not the focus of the story, but it was quite a striking kind of tangential aspect of the story, that he had been raised by deaf parents and he was a hearing person. So
yeah, that's great, because that's just casually mentioning, deafness within society, and that's what we need to see more of anyway.
I think it was published in about 1997, so it's not that recent. And I remember that it instilled in the son an expressiveness and reliance, and it wasn't portrayed as being negative. It was portrayed as being very positive, but a reliance on text rather than speaking, and how that played itself out in his relationship with his partner. So yeah, very interesting novel. Now you are connected to something called.
Would it be the Irish Climate Writing?
Irish Climate Writing, is it a group? What is that? I'd like to hear more about that and what kind of reading that has brought forth.
Well, the Climate Writing group based at the Irish Writers' Centre is something that I set up this year, and it's part of an international movement of climate writers who engage in writing and reading anything to do with the climate, and which has positive solutions for imagining a positive future for us. So it's not necessarily writing about the doomsday apocalypses, which we're imagining are about to befall us if we do nothing. It's about writing about things that we can do to save the planet before anything terrible happens. And that can be, forefronting that in the novel so that it's all about climate change, or it could be about embedding it in small ways into literature like I do. So I've set that up, and my reading has been around that for the past year and a half, I suppose. And I've been intensively reading everything that I can lay my hands on fiction-wise, trying to find the books which have positive solutions to the climate crisis in. Now, that's a big ask of literature, because it's very, very specific. And has this piece of literature got is it fiction, and does it have positive solutions to the climate crisis in it without killing us all off first?
I'm sure there's just scads of dystopic treatments of the topic.
Yeah, so yeah. It's quite hard. It's quite hard, and I think that's our duty then as climate writers. I mean, we are writers in the writing group, so we're not just reading these books. It's our job to write them. So what Willow Says is actually one of my examples of including embedded positive climate solutions into the story. So it's in 3 places I've slipped in positive solutions to the climate crisis, and they're really subtle. I'm not kind of, I wear my themes lightly in that sense. You might not have realised when you're reading a literary novella that they're in there and that you're being told about positive solutions. One would be the rewilding. It's just a little mention. I just slipped that in, about the main character letting a garden overgrow.
Right.
So it's creating little biodiverse environments. So it's normalising those behaviours through literature, which I'm keen to do, and I'm keen to reach wider audiences through literature and to educate them about things that we can do to prevent further climate crisis. Because basically, people like you and I traditionally would walk into a bookshop and would walk straight past the environmental section, and we wouldn't really take any notice of the nature writing either. So this is a way of getting writers who write they might write romance novels, they might write historical fiction, they might write literary fiction, and getting them to include bits and pieces of climate writing, climate solutions into their literature. So it's embedding it. Now, we do have writers as well who completely concentrating on eco-fiction. Amitav Ghosh realised in about 2016 that he really wanted to include climate solutions in his literature, and Gun Island is one example of that. I think he published that in 2019.
I have it right here. It's unread, but I have it.
There you go. That's a really interesting novel, and it's pure fiction, and it's about a very, very near future climatic disasters of flooding, and what are the solutions that we could put in place to avoid that happening. And The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson would be another catch-all solutions to avoiding the climate crisis, set literally in 2 years' time. So there is the heat waves which we are having now. He predicted, obviously, those are going to happen anyway. So he set that in 2 years' time, and puts in place all the kind of governance, fiscal, justice type solutions. Everything that you can think of in terms of how do you solve the problem of the climate crisis are in the novel, and The Ministry for the Future and Gun Island, and how do we do that? So it's kind of a way of educating them. And another person who I really like their style of writing at the moment, and she's actually really more of a non-fiction writer, is Kerri Dochartaigh. She's an Irish writer from Northern Ireland, now living in the Republic, and she's published this year a memoir called Thin Places. But she's also written a lot of short stories as well, and I particularly like anything that she's written because of her writing style. It's very similar to mine, I think. That's why I like it. I kind of immediately relate to the way that she writes, and she definitely writes a lot about the nature around her and the bogs where she lives now as well. But Thin Places is a memoir of growing up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and basically seeing what a child should never see in terms of conflict and war. So she writes about that really well, and about how nature is an escape for her, and finding those places, the thin places, where she can find some solace. So nature writing is a form of solace in that memoir, and I find that quite a beautiful piece of writing, a very insightful understanding of mental health as well. And another contemporary one which came out this year, which isn't a novel either, but it might be more useful in one of your videos on words and vocabulary, but that's 32 Words for Field by Manchán Magan. He's very famous in Ireland because he's a TV presenter as well, and he's an Oscailga. He talks Irish rather than English, and that's a study of all the lost words that are in Irish based around nature. And I use a few in what Willow says. I pick up Oscailga and I kind of throw them into the book where appropriate, because living in Ireland, most people are too scared or embarrassed, unless they're in the Gaeltacht area, to use the Irish language. but we kind of throw it into a sentence halfway through. I'm sure Ronan does as well. As a civil servant, he's obliged to know Irish language, but the rest of us are just like, oh no, I couldn't possibly remember all of that. It's been drummed into kids in school for 18 years, and we still can't speak it. But words will fall into the sentence midway, obviously. And I think Magan is a great promoter of the Irish language. And he makes collections of words which are falling out of use because they'd be old-fashioned. And he's put them into collections of 32 words for field is one of them. Wow, how many different words can you get to describe differences of things? And I find the same with sign language. The vocabulary can do things in sign language which it can't do in English spoken language, and Osceola can do things which the English spoken language cannot do, and Icelanders too. They would have 32 words for snow. So each culture has a lot to bring to the reader.
Well, Lynn, this has been a delightful conversation that I think we could probably keep going for a couple more hours. But rather than do that, I would love to have you come back anytime.
I'd love to, Shawn. I just cannot stop talking about books, and to talk to somebody who actually is interested in listening about books as well is an absolute treat.
I'll put all of the books that you have talked about in the show notes for people to go and read. I'll be wanting to read quite a few of them myself, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you more about your novels in our next chat, and maybe you'll even be able to show us some of that art that was inspired by what Willow says. But I'll let you think about that. You don't have to commit yet.
I'd love to, Shawn. I'd absolutely love to. Thank you so much.